Do we build in the way we think? Do we go to great lengths to input how we think? Do we scrape the internet to see how we're thinking? Or do we not sort of base everything on how we think and how we think we think? Instead, figure out what works by interacting with the world and all of its complexity. And so this is what is described in the bitter lesson. This is like a big round case of the bitter lesson.
Everything always comes back to the bitter lesson. that is in fact part of the bitter lesson.
Welcome to the Darby Mills series, Intrepid Pioneers of the Next Economy, featuring discussions with entrepreneurs at the forefront of deploying machine intelligence and brainstorming sessions about where the technology may go at the limit.
Welcome to the Darby Mills series, Intrepid Pioneers of the Next Economy. I'm Ajay Agrawal, co-founder of Intrepid Growth Partners, and I'm here with my three collaborators, all of whom are senior advisors at Intrepid. Richard Sutton, who pioneered reinforcement learning, Sendhil Mullainathan, professor at MIT, and Niamh Gavin, the CEO of Emergent Platforms. Today, we are going to discuss a brand new paper by Richard Sutton and his collaborator, David Silver. Let's get started. So we're going to talk for a few minutes, just kick us off here with this new paper by David Silver and Rich. And the paper is called Welcome to the Era of Experience. And the paper is linked in the show notes. And so listeners can reference the paper directly if you're interested, which I highly recommend. It's a very easy to read. You don't have to have a technical background to read this paper. And his co-author, David Silver, is very interesting. He was a graduate student of Rich's, and then he went to DeepMind. And one of the projects that he led at DeepMind was AlphaZero. And AlphaZero was quite a big deal in general, but it was a particularly big deal in terms of its success, my understanding of having quite a big impact on the Chinese government. And it was when AlphaZero was demonstrated its capabilities, beating the world's Go master, that the Chinese government decided that they were going to really lean into this. And that was the spark. My understanding, at least one of the key sparks that motivated very significant investment by the Chinese government in this technology. So this paper is written by Rich and David, and if we can bring up the slide, one of the opening points is they make the case that this age of experience is an age that we are just entering now. And so I've got three questions. Each time I'm going to ask you, Rich, a question, hear your response, and then turn it to Niamh and Sendhil if they have anything else that they'd like to comment or question or add. So my first question, just why now? Why is this the time for the age of experience?
Well, we've been in the era of human data. We've been very successful with that. It's been really, really powerful. But right now, we are starting to feel the limitations of human data, or that we're reaching the limits of what's available on the internet. And so that's, there are all these hints of these things. There's Ilya's comments at NIPS, and there are suggestions that all the big companies are now having a difficult time getting more quantum leaps in their abilities just by using more computation. They're starting to reach the limits of what the data is available.
And Rich, for people who aren't in this discipline, can you just share the essence of Ilya's comments? And Ilya, that he's referring to, was one of the co-founders of OpenAI.
Well, I wasn't there, and I'd be giving you a third person. I'm wondering if our other people, if Niamh or Sendhil were there.
We were in Vancouver, but unfortunately had competing talks at the time. So it perhaps continue, Rich.
Okay, let's carry on.
Well, my understanding is he just said just that we are reaching the limits, and he's trying to imagine other ways of getting more data, accelerating the performance.
And Rich, in the paper you say, when agents are able to autonomously act and observe in streams of real-world experience, and where the rewards may be flexibly connected to any of an abundance of grounded real-world signals. And so my takeaway from this was the reason that you're making the argument that now is the time is that, one, we are getting diminishing returns from human data, and two, we have increasing capacity for autonomous agents, which is a requisite for the age of experience. We need agents that are able to interact and have their own experiences to learn from.
That's exactly right. We're connecting the AIs to the world more and more. And so there's now the opportunity to see the consequences of their actions and for there to be consequences of their actions. In the past, the consequences of the actions, they would just say something, they would communicate something to a person, and maybe the person would behave differently, but there were no direct consequences of what they did.
Niamh, anything on your side just in terms of the timing of this? When you got to see this paper, did it sort of resonate for you?
Oh, absolutely. But it's possibly because I like hearing my own thoughts played back to me. So maybe I'm not the most discerning of audiences. But I think we could unpack a little bit on the why now. So in terms of the Gen AI chapter of Agentic, so to not get into a debate on definitions, we can call them task executing bots for now, as opposed to true agents. As it all played out last year within this Gen AI frame, literally from Q1 to now, we've had this compounding of the key capabilities, AJ, just as you alluded to there, of that ability to interact with real world data. So initially, when we were trying to incorporate agents into the models, they were just predefined workflows enabling tool use and function calling, but they lacked the cognitive primitives to dynamically execute and be a agent native in their capabilities. So the first thing that OpenAI did was then enable them to release code, not just text. So the first iteration of that was JSON mode, but that was quite brittle because you really require native grammars, structured output with specific schemas, delimiters, these type of code capabilities. So they started to add those functions in, and the canonical example back then was like always a weather app. What's the weather where I am? But it was still a very brittle, single turn, almost impractical one stop. There was no flow to the workflow. And then over time, it began to evolve into multi-agent systems. So breaking down the task into these specialized tasks with sub-goals. And you'd have a kind of a planner or an orchestrator model at the top, and then these experts underneath. So what was MOE model started to become MOA. But due to the lack of a real-time API or bidirectional streaming in a data sense, and the fact that the context windows back then were quite small, they just weren't context aware. So there wasn't that continuity as things were passed between agents. There'd be a breakdown in that understanding. So then they also realized that they needed the interweb and local terminals to go out and search beyond what the model was trained on. And so then they started to add search capabilities. And initially it was extensions by the folk at Brave or Exa, until everyone started to be able to connect live with the web to search. And then on top of that, we had computer use and orchestrators such that you could then draw that search back to live actions within your terminal or within the GUI or the interface that we're used to seeing to perform those actions. And again, the task there was like book a flight was what everyone was doing. And then they said, okay, that's fine for like a certain end-to-end, but we want to plug into all these other ecosystem players that are out there, such as, your e-commerce or your travel market. So at first it was a plug-in marketplace, but for whatever reason that didn't take off. And a lot of the LLM feeds are text-based. So there was some issues around a need for a protocol to interact with these data sets. And that's where, towards the end of the year, also around NIPS, MCP, this context protocol came out to enable the LLMs to kind of interact with the data feeds. And over this time, we started to then break down the interface of chat into this chain of thought, like step-by-step reasoning workflow or like thinking mode, both on the training and execution side. And then again, there's always this back and forth between the model and the developers. They wanted, as opposed to just all these, back then it was like models with APIs calling APIs, you really need SDKs. And so that's when, just the past 2 months or so, you saw OpenAI release its Agentic SDK, and then Google come back with it. And that enables you to then do everything from orchestration of the models and the flow at the top to like the evals, the deployment, and real-time analysis. And then more recently, Google's then come back with its own agent-to-agent protocol, which enables agents to, from any provider or model or your own, to interact and communicate with each other. And then the last piece of the current puzzle was exactly as Rich alluded to, how do you make that stream not just a workflow, but a continuous stream of thought, for lack of a better word. And so OpenAI's now provide a greater memory across or between sessions of an individual.
So for listeners that don't have a technical background, when you take this, the evolution that you're describing, and you were to kind of, this is the one sentence summary of why now, your answer is?
That we've progressed from model providers just being a model with an API to full stack AI native computing, or an operating system, or they call it compound AI systems. So the model now can analyze, decide, and act within a single loop, similar to how you have operating systems within your Mac to date. And I would say the last thing I'd say, which is kind of that exponential at the limit kind of tick that we're moving towards, this learn by doing is not only currently for software-based tasks, but it's also the principle behind these embodied agents in the physical robot form that you're now seeing this renewed interest in humanoids. Because again, rather than encoding the rules of the physical world, if you can put these moving sensing machines out there and they can learn that by trial and error you can't walk through walls, and that water is wet, but also they're multimodal in the sense of they have cameras, listening devices. So as they interact with humans, they're also better at seeing and learning on gestures, facial expressions, tone. And if you put them in a range of environments in different countries doing different tasks, all feeding back into the single learning model, you're able to get a far greater, more nuanced, less stochastic parrot hallucinating chatbot that Rich alluded to. So there's some of the reasons for why now, and the very Gen AI blinder kind of aspect, as opposed to Rich's 40 years of working on this.
and thanks, Niamh. Sendhil, anything that you would add to the why now?
Yeah, I'll add something. This is a fantastically interesting, provocative paper, Rich, but I'll add one thing, which is something that I often think about every time, even in the era of human data, which is that for sure some of the era of experience we could talk about having to do with robots and stuff like that. But from my point of view, it's like the really first order thing that seems to have driven this discussion, but actually driven the era of human data, actually driven all the ML innovations we've had, is that we've taken so much of our life online, that so much of life is now digital. And in the first generation, it was digital and accessible as data. Now it's digital and accessible to agents who can then actually interact in that digital world. But the prime mover of a lot of this is actually the digitization of everyday life. And we would have required much bigger movements in data collection or much bigger changes in robotics and things to be seeing any of these curves had we not had that initial move. So it's kind of interesting that you could have said, it's really social media that we have to thank for. I mean, it's the things that you would never have thought, like, you don't sit around thinking that, but that is an enormous contributor to this. It's the sort of background story here, without which there would be no story.
Okay, let's move to the second question. And this one, Niamh, has a bit of history, because before Derby Mill, we were, Sendhil and another a chemistry professor who's trying to make these self-driving chemistry labs with full feedback loop. We were having a call with Rich, and the question was, isn't science the final frontier for reinforcement learning? Like, in other words, it's a learner and create the opportunity to just take off in terms of scientific inquiry. And at the time, at least my interpretation at the time, Sendhil and I may have slightly different interpretations, was that Rich was reasonably lukewarm to the science discussion, and so we dropped it. Like we had that call, and then we didn't sort of pursue it. And then when I read this paper, there's a sentence in the paper where he's talking about the various domains that will benefit from the age of experience, and there's a sentence that says, "Perhaps the most transformative will be the acceleration of scientific discovery." So, Rich, let you open this, and then back to Niamh and Sendhil.
Maybe in the sense of taking things to the limit, maybe it is the ultimate area of impact, but it is kind of ultimate, and there are going to be many areas that are like it that are just ordinary. Like, you give you a new robot, and you have to figure out how to walk, and it's not scientific discovery, but it's just figuring out how this particular world works. Or, you're a person, you're working in some company working with other people. How do you interact with those people to get your job done? This is just ordinary things, and those things will happen first. But the ultimate thing could be science. It's a really good example of where we don't know the answers. You can't find the answers in the internet because they're unknown, and so you have to discover them. And so it's a really clear example for the paper, and maybe it is the ultimate impact of advanced AI to discover new knowledge.
Niamh, anything that you'd like to add on this one?
Absolutely. I was so excited too, because I think, as I say too often, for me, I always want AI to be able to do things that I can't. And the ultimate for me is just AI for scientific discovery. But that said, it's no mean task, in the sense of what you really want is exactly what Rich alluded to in the paper, and is also what I've kind of been espousing, of this open-ended search from first principles. So it to be able to do this boundless global sweep from design to delivery of the scientific method. But the key bit is that free from our anthropocentric lens, so without the human priors or inductive biases. And that's really difficult. This is where you get into this recursive loop, as kind of what to Sendhil say. Well, in that extent, what do you feed it initially? Because all our data has been generated by us, in the sense of, we even compartmentalize biology and science into physics, chemistry, and biology, where they're all just different levels of spectrums of the same thing, right? Biology is fundamentally rooted in chemistry and physics. We state observations as laws as opposed to working assumptions. All of that is embedded in the data that exists across the entire scientific method, where what you really want is a totally fresh pair of eyes, like an alien to land down from space and just think and ask, what if? And in doing so, generate this new way of exploring and encoding scientific laws. And so it's almost from that inter to extra to hyperpolation, a totally new paradigm, which is fascinating. But then where do you start, right? Because you do want it within an RL environment, and especially one that creates this long-term learning environment of self-discovery, free of our inductive biases, but also without generating the impossible. It can hallucinate wild and come up with all these things that just physically aren't feasible. So with that kind of constraint and non-constraint, how do you define the goal, loss function, and reward, right? And ideally, you want to make each of those things themselves dynamic, differentiable, and open-ended, and able to refine as it learns. So there were kind of two ways that we've tried to iterate on this in the past, is going back to the same way that we've done everything, a mix of real-world data and then dynamic simulation. So on the real-world data, we would try and use all the capabilities that we've developed in the past decades or so. So things like time-lapse videos, be it of nature sped up or actual microscopy, so different levels of observations. Lab experimentation, just exactly as the Gaspardo lab in Toronto is doing, whereby you use active learning in these ironically closed loop systems for open-ended search, whereby it generates and tests hypotheses and then annotate that kind of and automate that entire pipeline. The good thing about those methods is, if you speed up iteration, you also will speed up the rate of innovation and get faster feedback loops. So that's generating the grounded real-world data that kind of Rich rightly said is so key for building these models. And then alongside, you have your traditional dynamic simulations, always like Conway's game of life type of approach, which randomly evolve per epoch but you just have to figure out what's the policy and reward mechanism within each run, and then just kind of ratchet up the complexity. So that's actually what DeepMind was phenomenal for doing back in the day with its gamings, OpenAI, Jim. It's actually what Isomorphic Labs, their spin out for drug discovery, is doing. Max is phenomenal there on that. So I totally agree. But when you start to actually try and take on the task, it's full of oxymorons, shall I say.
I think if we were to ask this question of Sendhil a year from now, he'll have a book on this, because this is a topic of great interest to him and me. He's written a couple of several papers already on AI and science. So, Sendhil, I'm sorry to have to ask you to do this in just a couple of minutes, but whatever bit you want to speak to.
No, I would love to discuss one. I think there's one question: is science, the act of science, equal to RL? Like, it's not like you could tell it both ways. I'll just I'll let you answer, Rich, for a second, but I'll just say my own thinking, this is my confusion. You could tell it one way, which is, of course, science is the codified activity of us understanding the world so that we can take actions in the world so that we can get payoffs. In that direction, it feels almost equivalent. But through another lens, science could be viewed as so much of it appears to be a passion to understand the world, even if it has no material consequences to us. Like when we look out at the stars and we're like, I want to map them. Sure, there's some benefits to how ships are navigated. There's some, but the primary itch was nothing to do with that. If you go to the double slit experiment, it wasn't like, oh, once I understand which way the double slit experiment goes, now I'll know this, which will have these mechanistic consequences. Of course, they did have consequences in the long run. If you told me, and if you told every physicist working today, there's no material consequences to figuring out string theory that's of any meaningful value, I don't think that would take away their interest, or frankly, our interest in knowing. And so I kind of go back and forth. Is science an activity which is exactly like RL? It's motivated by material consequences for the utilities we care about. Or is science an activity from which material stuff follows, but we have some other aesthetic interest, which I don't know what that is? So anyway, I'm putting that out there because I'm not 100% sure I myself know.
Rich, anything you'd like to say there?
Well, a couple things. First, I don't really think there's any conflict between those two. You want to discover the way the world works so you can do get what you do want. But often the connection is distant, and so it's often best just to figure out how things work and leave it for later to see if there are any utilitarian consequences. I'm also struck by, how do we understand, what is the ultimate reinforcement thing, or what is the ultimate intelligence thing? And, the thing that helps for me is to think of the AI as being like people. People are, and so what's the ultimate purpose of people? You could say that the ultimate purpose of people is the science. We understand the world. The ultimate significance of civilization is, their ability, their discoveries about science, and the discoveries about the ability to manipulate and control and understand the world. And so, why wouldn't it be, if we're trying to make artificial intelligence, that they would have the same ultimate purpose? Carrying it to the limit. The purpose of people is to understand the universe, and similarly for AI.
Can I push back on that, Rich, just because I want to see how far we can take this? In the moments where I'm like, these are two distinct activities, it's in the moments where I'm like, it becomes vacuous what we put in the payoff function. So for example, let me give you the most extreme example. Suppose I invented a far more elegant proof of some complex math conjecture for which currently we only have a 20-page proof, and I have a very elegant 1-page proof. There's something deeply aesthetically satisfying about that. And the utility that it is giving me is a purely aesthetic utility. There's no action in the world, there's no consequence which I'm now informed about. And we could say, well, great, let's put that aesthetic utility in. But if we put that aesthetic utility, I worry things are becoming a little bit too, it's like we can bake anything in at that point. So, and I know science is not the same as that, but there does seem to be an element of science where it is unclear to me in that element whether, yeah, do you see what I'm getting at? Is it's like, to what degree is there some other component of human exploration? I'm not wedded to this. I'm just sort of trying to provoke the conversation. Yeah.
I see it. I think, though, it really works out really well. If you think about it in a utilitarian sense, we like simplicity. A simple understanding is one we're going to be able to apply in new situations. We can understand it, first of all. We can see how it applies. So I think there's an inherent bias. It's sort of a utilitarian bias for simplicity because we're going to use it. I'm reminded of like when you go on a walk and you hike up a mountain and you get to the top and you look out over the land and how that's aesthetically pleasing.
Yes.
We all feel it's very aesthetically pleasing. But then, think about it for a while. It's also like really good. Let's say you're going to try to hunt prey. And if you can get to see the layout, or even if you just want to understand where are things located with respect to each other, when you get up that hill and you can see things,
this is
that
fantastic.
is very utilitarian. But we don't see it that way. Maybe it's just built into us to like it because evolution realizes it will be useful to us in ways that we don't necessarily predict. This makes total sense.
You're sort of saying, if I were to crudely put it, that even if the ultimate reward is X, that in the process of optimizing that ultimate reward, there's a lot of more intermediate rewards that are created for the act of optimizing that ultimate reward. And those then too will feel like utility, like the aesthetic pleasure of simplicity, which we may come to optimize for itself. Its origin comes from actually being in some way related to the original ultimate material reward. That's great. Yeah, okay. That's a good reconciliation.
But wait a second. One of the points that Rich makes in the paper is the distinction between grounded and ungrounded rewards. And I think he would characterize those aesthetic feelings as ungrounded.
Ungrounded, yeah.
And the point in the paper is the way for these two agents to become superhuman is to focus them not on ungrounded, but rather grounded. And so that means that they don't get the reward signals that are things we can't articulate that we feel good about. And maybe we don't even know why we feel good about them.
Exactly. Objective objectives are the ultimate reward. But I would say that Sendhil does kind of bring up an interesting point. I would say you always delineate between the mission of the act and the method. So I agree with you that humans can be intrinsically motivated by something, not just for a goal-seeking reward, but just out of curiosity. And I always say the thing that differentiates us in biology is really hormones, as opposed to the rest. It's that endorphin rush of getting up the hill is the thing, that the dopamine effect and reward, as opposed to just the genetic meme driver of nature versus nurture. But I would say the method is very similar to RL of science. So the scientific method is very much trial and error, cause and effect, consequence of actions. And so maybe that's one way to separate the two. Of the motivating factor may be different, which is how we've always kind of seen robots and bots is they're not emotionally driven, they're functionally driven, and we're a bit more emotional curiosity driven. But actually, the method by which we go through learning is quite similar. And actually, if you want to take it further, but one for another day, the counter to kind of the goal-seeking agent AI is the more Bayesian approach of causal AI, which is a focus on understanding and critical thinking over goal pursuit. So there are those who are saying actually causal relationships that are indicative of how changes in one factor influence another enables models not only to predict, but explain and act. So you have more critical thinking, which is a bit more human-esque on that scale versus just, goal, policy, reward. But yeah, fascinating one for another day.
I want to add one thing, which for me sheds some light on this, which is that according to the theory of reinforcement learning, the pleasure is basically the TD error, pleasure and pain. And it's interesting, in the TD error, there's two parts. One is the reward part, and one is the change in your value, which the value is your estimate of how well you're doing. So these two are added together. So reward and change in value are added together, and you only see the sum. Sometimes you only feel the sum. And so because of that, you can't tell, and you there's not obvious to you what's really the reward and what's a change in value. And so these, we're never going to be able to tell. Maybe the chess players, they see this position, they just like this position. It just makes them feel good. And maybe when we get to the vista and we look out at the plane and it feels good. Aesthetically, it feels good. Simplicity feels good. We can't tell if these are built into our machinery as rewards, or if they're an aesthetic we've learned as a value function, or even that it's a built-in aesthetic we learn as a value function. It's not going to be obvious to us ever which of these it is, and they blend together in really interesting ways.
All right, we just have a couple of minutes for the last question, which is on the human-like versus superhuman. And a key point of the age of experience is that we get kind of capped at human-like with the types when we train our models on human data. And the quote from the paper is, "This era of experience will likely be characterized by agents and environments that, in addition to learning from vast quantities of experiential data, will break through the limitations of human-centric AI systems. Furthermore, the pursuit of this agenda by the AI community will spur new innovations in these directions that rapidly progress AI towards truly superhuman agents." So maybe I'll start with Niamh and then Sendhil, and then let Rich have the last word on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is where I think the real impact is to be had. And I kind of alluded to it earlier, as to by having that non-constrained thinking and, in essence, boundless exploration from first principles and from fresh thinking, you can just let it be and attack problems in a way that, if we're observing, which is why Rich emphasizes in the paper, sometimes when you're seeing something that may not seem logical to human, actually that's additive to our thinking because it's coming up with an entirely new flow and way of approaching things. That, to me, is where AI really augments scientific discovery and human thinking, because it's not just taking tasks in the way that we do things today and replicating them and automating them and freeing up our time to go back to being Renaissance men, but it itself almost becomes a Renaissance thinking of this next AI generation, whereby it's taken off all the blinkers that we've kind of imposed on ourselves and just says, what if, and keeps double clicking on that. And the challenge we have is, how long do we let it go down a certain path before we decide to course correct because the ultimate outcome is just not physically feasible, or let it go through to its full cycle and closed loop to discover that itself, because there are many things. And I think there was this terrific sentence in Richard's paper where it says, if you ask humans to kind of encode and do science 1,000 years ago, it would be Newtonian physics. Then today it would be more quantum mechanics. So that is, I think, a great synopsis for us to keep in mind as to when we let AI roam free, because even if it comes up with possibilities that we think are just not physically possible, they may actually be.
Thanks, Niamh. Sendhil?
Yeah, I'll add two things. One is in sort of the conceit of sort of mini science fiction novels, you'll get this thing where there's this alien species, but on their planet, it's nitrogen based. And because of that, and so as a result, their intelligence is very different than ours. And the reason I'm emphasizing that, it is worth noting that whatever world in which these agents are moving around, it is related to, but is not a carbon copy of the world in which we're moving around. And if, in some sense, it could be very different if we get rid of the robot part and focus on the digital part. Like, the mind needed to navigate just the digital part of our lives will be very different. And so, again, you can add other things, but what this means is it really would at least give you a principled way of thinking about how you really could end up with two very different kinds of intelligence. And by a variety of measures, for sure, these algorithms will see many things that humans didn't comprehend and that are truths that we can learn from them. But by some other measure as well, to the extent that we are inhabiting a different thing, there may be truths that we see that they have yet to comprehend. And so it is worth noting there is a speciation point here. Unless we think we've reached the point where every single input that we're getting, I don't think they're getting a superset of our inputs. The other point, which is also worth making, is that if we carry the relation to humans completely forward, there isn't human intelligence. There's 8 billion human intelligences, and there isn't an understanding of the world. There's 8 billion understandings of the world, and they don't agree. They don't agree, drastically do not agree. And on certain dimensions, that kind of lack of agreement leads to many, many, many problems. But if we take that point seriously, then why would we believe that there's going to be a single superintelligence in digital form? If we run 50 RL agents, is there any reason to believe we won't end up with 50 intelligences that disagree? The conceit of convergence certainly has not held for human beings. Science, for example, one of the other things when I ask how is science different, science is an attempt at enforcing convergence between us, a form of not just communicating our data, but communicating with some principles and ground rules that we must agree and we can't agree to disagree. There's a set of things that we tend to do to force convergence, but it's a very limited pocket of the universe. I mean, I think on nearly everything, even scientists tend to disagree, even on the domain. So I'm just pointing out that I think multiplicity is a problem that it feels like we haven't really thought hard about.
Thanks, Sendhil. Rich, the last minute is yours.
A couple points. Experience provides much more data. You make new data. Every robot interacting with its world is generating data which can be used particularly for that robot. And it's also a better progression. Rather than just having masses of data, like masses of people talking on the internet, you have, because the robot or the agent is generating its own data, that data is customized to the agent's level of understanding. You can generate things that are at the edge of what he understands. It's just the way all the game playing systems can play against each other. And so they're always playing against a skill that's at the right level for improvement. They play against the copies themselves. And so they always have to get better. And so this is something you also get when you're generating your own data. Now, secondly, experience brings reality. Not just more data, but real data. Instead of a presumption about what's going to happen, instead of a presumption about the facts that people believe, or the presumption about the methods by which you gather more data, you see what actually works. So, and these two things make experience much more powerful, potentially much more powerful than using human data. And so what we see, I don't know about you guys, but for me, this is all very familiar. It's like a mega instance of the bitter lesson, in my opinion. Do we build in the way we think? Do we go to great lengths to input how we think? Do we scrape the internet to see how we're thinking? Or do we not sort of base everything on how we think and how we think we think? Instead, figure out what works by interacting with the world and all of its complexity. And so this is what is described in the bitter lesson. This is like a big round case of the bitter lesson.
Everything always comes back to the bitter lesson. that is in fact part of the bitter lesson. And that's our show for today. Thanks to my colleagues Rich, Sendhil, and Niamh for their thoughts and comments on Rich's new paper, along with David Silver. Welcome to the era of experience. Follow us on the Intrepid Substack at insights.intrepidgp.com. And subscribe on your favorite platforms, YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and others. Thanks, everyone, for listening.
The views, opinions, and information expressed in this podcast are those of the hosts and guests and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Intrepid Growth Partners. This content is for informational purposes only and should not be considered as financial, investment, or legal advice.